Go for it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys, for having me. So I'm going to just quickly go over kind of an overview of what I'm doing here in a slide deck, and then we'll jump straight into a demo. So the topic really wasn't that clearly explained in when I first signed up here. So basically what I'm trying to do is manage my NMS exclusively through NetBox using webhooks. So the goal is, we've got a few goals. First is centralization. So I want to keep everything in NetBox. And if NetBox is not the source of truth for some kind of information, then we at least want NetBox to reflect that truth. Or if it can model that intent or that truth, then we want that to happen. And really also just want NetBox to be a single pane of glass for as much as possible. It's not ever going to take over everything, but whatever it can, that's what it should do. I'm also looking for an efficient approach here. So we don't want to duplicate any effort. As we onboard devices in NetBox, that's already got enough of a process. We don't want to have to duplicate that for our NMS as well. And because the process is so fairly involved, we also don't want to really think about it. I don't want to have to wonder, did I forget this step, or did I do something incorrectly? I want to have as much of that automated as possible. Also looking for uniformity, so keeping everything in sync, and ideally in real time. I thought about doing a script that would run nightly, and I thought that doesn't really work, because now we've got 10, 12 hours potentially between when a device goes into production and when we're actually monitoring in our NMS. So we need it to be real time. And I also want this solution to be boring. Boring is simple. Boring is reliable. Boring is really what I think every bit of production code should be. It can be exciting to implement. It can be exciting to kind of connect the dots, but the ultimate end result really shouldn't be more than just what it needs to do, and to do it well. So my approach involves a set of custom fields that model all of our SNMP, or rather all of our monitoring fields. So that includes our monitoring protocol. So we can either do ICMP or SNMP. And then also any other things like either the name credential set if we're using v3, or the community string if we're using a v2. We also have, falling right on the heels of that, is a set of custom validators to make sure that those custom fields are correct. What I'm doing there is also making sure that all of the devices that should get monitoring fields set actually do have them set, and they're set correctly. I'll demonstrate those in just a minute. Of course, the meat and potatoes here is the webhook, and I've enabled that both on devices and VM object types for creation, updating, and deleting those events. Those are all fire off a webhook. Those are then consumed by a custom webhook processor, basically just a Flask app that I have running on one of our VMs that receives that webhook and then processes that into API calls for our NMS. And then finally, we have some tags that I'll show you what they do in a little bit. And the results, pretty straightforward, pretty boring. Real-time state sync, host name, IP, any changes there, they get updated. Site region, and even geolocation, so lat long, that'll show up in our map. I can't demonstrate that in my lab today, but in prod, that it'll show up actually on a map based on the lat long in NetBox for the site. Polling method, again, whether it's ICMP or SNMP, and then any SNMP details, all of those can be changed directly in NetBox, and they'll reflect in real time in SolarWinds. So let's jump right into a demo. So here we've got a mock-up here in my dev environment. My security team was very good at their job, and they asked me to redact basically everything. So we've got R2-D2 sitting here on Tantive 4, which is the spaceship in the beginning of the first Star Wars movie, in the outer rim, and he's pointing at Google Public DNS. Didn't even want me to point to a lab machine. Then we also have a totally vanilla SolarWinds instance over here. Everything that's going to show up will show up in here, but at this point, there's absolutely nothing. So the first thing I have, if I go to we'll notice here is that he's in plan state. I've already mocked up everything else here, and he's got nothing in the monitoring fields for these custom fields. So if I decide to move him from plan to active, and I just ignore all those monitoring fields, I'm going to get an error. It says this device or VM requires NMS monitoring. So I have to set the polling method because this is a router and when status is set to active or staged. So there's some granularity there. We don't always have to have monitoring fields defined. It's only for those devices that require it. So I say, okay, fine. I'll do SNMP. Oh, guess what? Can't just give me SNMP. You also have to give me an SNMP version. And the same thing goes on if I give it SNMP v2, but I don't give a v2 read-only or read-write community string, then it also errors out. Because I have to use Google Public DNS and they don't respond to SNMP, for the sake of node creation here, I'm just going to use ICMP, and we'll play with these in just a minute. So at this point, he is active and he has ICMP. We don't get an error, and in just a minute there, if I refresh this page, I now have a SolarWinds ID. So the webhook now gave me the unique ID in SolarWinds, which then also is fed into a custom link, which gives me this button right here. So I can now open directly the link to SolarWinds. And for ICMP nodes, there's really not much to see here. I mean, there's really nothing to monitor except for response time and packet loss. If we go to edit node here, you can confirm, well, you don't even have to see that, but you can see that ICMP is the set polling method, and there's really nothing else to see. Now that it's created, actually, before I jump over there, let's go back to the home screen. If I refresh this, you can see that we've now inherited not just R2D2, but also his site and region. So that's all there. Let's go back to here and let's make some changes. So now that it's created, I can actually switch it to SNMP without any issues. Let's do v2. And we can provide both a read-only and read-write community string. For now, I'll just use read-only. If I go back over here, refresh this page, we now see that we're at v2c. We're using default and the community string I set. If I go back over here, change to v3. We can actually leave the v1 and v2 community string because those will still be there for if we switch back to v2, but say v3, let's just create a named credential set. And what's cool about the v3 is that I'm just mapping on a named credential set. I'm not actually storing any secrets or any other parameters. All that's stored privately in SolarWinds. So I refresh over here, you'll see we go to v3 and we have all this pre-populated. Some other things we can change. We can rename him to C3PO, and we can put him on Tatooine. Oh, I already have C3PO somewhere, so we'll do R5 E4. And then if we, sorry, Zoom's in the way here. Refresh here. We'll see that we are now in Tatooine and we're now called R5D4. So all that's really straightforward. Again, hopefully boring. Like hopefully it's just so straightforward, you don't even think about it. One last thing I'll show is managing status. So when I go from active to, let's say, offline, that's a state that we actually don't use that much. But if we did, it would unmanage the device. So if we refresh this, it's now unmanaged. You can tell by this little blue X right here. That means we're no longer collecting any statistics. It hasn't been deleted, of course, from SolarWinds, but it's, for all intents and purposes, it's not really there. Again, we don't use that state very often, but it's there if we need it. Let's go back to active. sure that syncs all right. And it'll stay gray for a minute while it's polling and making sure that everything's okay there. But last thing I'll show is we also have tags for managing things like maintenance. So again, idea being NetBoxes are single source of truth. All of our intended state is modeled somehow in NetBox. And that means that even devices that are under scheduled maintenance, that's somehow reflected in NetBox. So that way, any scripts that might be running can, maybe exclude them. Say, oh, I see they're under maintenance, so there's no point in trying to pull a config back up, for example, if it's possibly offline. If I do that, hit save, you actually won't see any real difference here because what we do is we put the device in, I think, what's called suppressed alert mode. And you don't really see that here on at least an ICMP hold node or non-SNMP enabled node. But you can kind of see right here, if I go to maintenance mode, I now have the option to resume alerts. And so that means that everything is it's BAU within SolarWinds. So all of the status updates will happen as usual, but they just won't fire an alert. And the same thing happens, the inverse rather happens when we take the NetBox or the maintenance tag off. And finally, to complete the lifecycle kind of demo here, when a device moves into decommissioning stage, at that point, it has been fully removed from production and it is removed from SolarWinds. So take a second to upgrade or update that. Notice that we no longer have our SolarWinds link here because the SolarWinds ID value has been cleared. And if we go back to our SolarWinds, we're back to nothing.